And so last week, Jordan spoke from Josiah to the young people. And so tonight, I want to speak to the young people and the older people. And tonight, I'm going to talk about a fellow by the name of Barzillai. Quiz. Hands raised. How many know who Barzillai is? Be honest. All right. This is going to be a good study. How many of you know who Josiah is? Okay, yeah. Good deal. Glad y'all listened last week. Obviously, Barzillai is not familiar to most people. And in an era in which many worship at the shrine of youth, those who are aged and those who will become aged someday, unless death precedes, need a role model to instruct us in proper attitudes and conduct as we get older. Just a brief account, if you turn to 2 Samuel chapter 19, beginning in verse 31. And Barzillai the Gileadite came down from Regulam and went across the Jordan with the king to escort him across Jordan. Now Barzillai was a very aged man, 80 years old. He had provided the king with supplies while he stayed at Mahanaim, for he was a very rich man. Some translations put therefore he was a very great man. And the king said to Barzillai, "Come across with me, and I will provide for you while you're with me in Jerusalem." Barzillai said to the king, "How long have I to live, that I should go up with the king to Jerusalem? I'm today 80 years old. Can I discern between the good and the bad? Can your servant taste what I eat or what I drink? Can I hear any longer the voice of singing in men and women? Why then should your servant be a further burden to my lord the king? Your servant will go a little way across the Jordan with the king. And why should the king repay me with such a reward? Please let your servant turn back again, that I may die in my own city, near the grave of my father and mother. But here's your servant Kimham. Let him cross over, my lord the king, and do for him what seems good to you." And the king answered, "Kimham shall cross over with me. I will do for him what seems good to you. Now, whatever you request of me, I will do for you." Then all the people went over Jordan, and when the king had crossed over, the king kissed Barzillai and blessed him, and he returned to his own place. The Holy Spirit says something about Barzillai that is not said about many people. As I said, there was one translation where in New King James it says he's a very rich man, is a very great man. There are not many in the Bible that are called a great man. His name means iron or strong. And he's what we would call today a head of a clan. One person said of Barzillai that he highlighted characteristics of loyalty, courtesy, hospitality, and a passionate love of the hills and valleys. His holdings were in a fertile territory of Gilead on the far side of Jordan. Another said that Barzillai blazes out for a brief moment, then like a meteor in a dark night sky, then plunges back into obscurity from which he has come. And I suppose that's a fair representation of how he appears. But Barzillai is described as a wealthy man. In fact, if you turn back to chapter 17, and pick up the reading in verse 26. So Absalom encamped in the land of Gilead. Now it happened when David had come to Mahanaim that Shobai, the son of Nahash, the son of Ribah, the son of Ammon, Maker, the son of Amiel, and Lodebar, and Barzillai the Gileadite from Regulam brought beds and basins and earthen vessels and wheat, barley, and flour and parched grain and beans, lentil and parched seeds, honey and curds, sheep and cheese of the herd for David and the people who were with him to eat. For they said, "The people are hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness." You can just imagine, here's Barzillai observing from a distance the coming and goings of all the leaders of Israel. He's seen Eli. He's seen Samuel. He's seen Saul. He's seen David. He's seen the failures of Eli, how Eli failed to restrain his sons. He's seen Samuel, and in fact, when Samuel died, it was Barzillai is said to have rejoiced over Samuel as a national hero. I would suppose a parallel to that would be like the passing of a president of the United States, and how we give honor to the passing of that president. And he lies in state in the Capitol building on a catafalque that Abraham Lincoln himself lied upon. It's always interesting that catafalque is always emphasized. This was the catafalque of Abraham Lincoln. That speaks to the honor given that man. And Barzillai regarded Samuel that way as well. But then he comes and he sees David. David's a different man. David is a man of a totally different character and a totally different behavior. He is a man after God's own heart. And he sees in David goodness. He liked the effective government of David. He liked the exceptional grace of David. And he felt a pull toward David, as though, as far as we know, until this record occurs, Barzillai had never met David face to face, which makes what happens here all the greater. Barzillai overall is best known for his loyal service to David as he was forced to flee from Jerusalem during a revolt by his son Absalom. So let's back up just a little bit, and let's get a running start of what takes place here. At this point in time, David has committed adultery with Bathsheba. At this point in time, the curse has come upon his house. The child conceived by Bathsheba has died. David echoes the words, I can't bring the child back, but I can go to him. Furthermore, Tamar, the daughter of David, is raped by her half-brother Amnon. And Amnon is slain by his half-brother and whole brother Tamar, Absalom. David did nothing about it. David did not answer the offense to Tamar. He did nothing to Amnon. And so Absalom, seeing this was his sister, said, this is not going to stand. And he took the life of Amnon. And then Absalom gives an insurrection, creates an insurrection, and runs his dad out of the city. And his dad escapes out of the city with his very life. Now then, Absalom is in battle, and Absalom dies. He dies at the hands of Joab. As his hair is caught in the branches, he's run through a spear. And as you come to chapter 18, David had said, don't hurt the lad, don't hurt the lad. And Joab, nonetheless, caught Absalom in a compromising situation and took his life. In the latter part of chapter 18, you have the lament of David. It says, then the king, verse 33, was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said thus, O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place, O Absalom, my son, my son. And Joab was told, behold, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. So the victory that day was turned to mourning for all the people, for the people heard it said that day, the king is grieved for his son. And all the people stole back into that city that day, as people who were ashamed still when they flee the battle. But the king covered his face, and the king cried out with a loud voice, O my son Absalom, O Absalom, my son Absalom. You see the effect of the death of Absalom. Though he had led the insurrection against his father and taken over his father's household and his father's wives, David grieved mightily. And the people see that, and the day of rejoicing is turned to a day of mourning instead. In chapter 19 and the first part of chapter 20, you have 5 characters that occur. In verses 16 through 23, you have the first 2. Read with me beginning in verse 16. And Shimei, the son of Gera, the Benjamite, who was from Bahurim, hurried and came down with the men of Judah to meet David. There were 1,000 men of Benjamin with him, and Ziba, the servant of the house of Saul, the 15 sons, and his 20 servants with him. And they went over Jordan before the king. Then a ferry boat went across over to carry the king's household and to do what he thought good. Now Shimei, the son of Gera, fell down before the king when he had crossed the Jordan. Then he said to the king, do not let my lord impute iniquity to me, or remember what wrong your servant did on that day when my lord the king had left Jerusalem, and the king should take it to heart. For I, your servant, know that I have sinned. Therefore Here I am, I first come today to all the house of Joseph to go down to meet my lord the king. And Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, answered and said, Shall not Shimei be put to death for this, because he cursed the Lord's anointed? And David said, What have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah, that you should be adversaries of me today? Shall any man be put to death today in Israel? For I do not know that today I am king over Israel. Therefore the king said to Shimei, You shall not die. And the king swore to him. If you turn back to chapter 16 real quickly. You turn back to chapter 16, you see beginning in verse 5. Now when King David came to Bahurim, there was a man from the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei, the son of Gera. Coming from there, he came out cursing continuously as he came. And he threw stones at David and all the servants of the king David. And all the people, all the mighty men were on his right hand and on the left. And Shimei said thus when he cursed, Come out, you bloodthirsty man, you rogue. The Lord has brought you all the blood of the house of Saul, whose place you have reigned, and the Lord has delivered the kingdom into the hand of Absalom your son. So now you are caught in your own evil, because you are a bloodthirsty man. Now you come to chapter 19, and you see Shimei is coming before David and saying, Please forgive me. I'm sorry. He cursed David, you bloodthirsty man. Here's the man that is the king. David says here, I don't know that I'm the king in chapter 19, because he's not being reinstated yet. That's going to take place. But Shimei is pleading for his life here, because he'd thrown stones at David and cursed David. Ziba, there's not much said about Ziba. He seems to be a fairly decent fellow. He just was a servant of Saul. Then you come to verses 24 through 30, and you find the third character. Now Mephibosheth, the son of Saul, came down to meet the king. And he did not care for his feet, nor trimmed his mustache, nor washed his clothes from the day the king departed until now. He returned in peace. So it was, when he had come to Jerusalem to meet the king, that the king said to him, Why did you not go with me, Mephibosheth? And he answered, My lord, O king, my servant deceived me. For your servant said, I will saddle a donkey for myself, that I may ride on it and go to the king, because he, your servant, is lame. And he has slandered your servant to my lord the king. But my lord the king is like the angel of God. Therefore do what is good in your eyes. For all my father's house were but dead men before my lord the king. Yet you, your servant, among those who eat at your own table. Therefore what right have I still to cry out any more to the king? So the king said to him, Why do you speak any more of your matters? I have said, You and Ziba divide the land. Then Mephibosheth said to the king, Rather let him take all the land, as much as my lord the king has come back in peace to do it to his own house. David has fled the city. Mephibosheth has not shaved, he's not bathed, he's not taken a bath. He's not done anything of a sanitary nature to cleanse himself since David's been gone. Mephibosheth has grieved David leaving. Then we come to chapter 20 and verses 1 through 3, and you find the fifth man in this verse. Now I realize I went 1, 2, 3 and skipped to 5. I really can't count that much, but we'll come back to number 4. In chapter 20, verse 1, and it happened to be there a rebel whose name was Sheba, the son of Bichri, a Benjamite, and he blew a trumpet and said, We have no share in David, nor do we have inheritance in the sons of Jesse. Every man to his tents, O Israel. So every man of Israel deserted David and followed Sheba, the son of Bichri. But the men of Judah from Jordan as far as Jerusalem remained loyal to the king. Now David came to the house of Jerusalem, and the king took the 10 women, his concubines, whom he had left to keep the house, and put them in seclusion and supported them, but he did not go into them, for they were shut up to the day of their death, living in widowhood. Now here you have Sheba, and Sheba is a very rebellious and wicked man as the king returns. Then you come back to chapter 19, and you have the passage that we read from verses 31 down through verse 39. Here is Barzillai. He ventured and volunteered to help David during one of the most darkest moments of David's life. In fact, if you go back to chapter 17 real quickly, David is fleeing. David is brokenhearted, he's tired, and he's running to save his life from his son Absalom. In chapter 17 and verse 16, it says, Now therefore send quickly and tell David, saying, Do not spend this night in the plains of the wilderness, but speedily cross over, lest the king and all the people who are with you be swallowed up. David, you stay there, you rest, you gain your strength. The enemy was ready to destroy King David. And after the King David crossed the Jordan and came to the place of Menahem, an elderly man by the name of Barzillai shows up, and you see that in verse 26. So Israel and Absalom encamped in the land of Gilead. Now it happened when David came to Menahem that Shobai the son of Nahash, and Rabbi the son of Ammon, and Machir the son of Ammiel, and Lodebar the Barzillai, the Gileadite from Regulum, brought beds and basins and vessels and wheat, barley, and flour, and parched grain, and beans, and lentil, and parched seeds, honey and curd, sheep and cheese of the herd, for David and the people who were with him to eat. For they said, the people are hungry. The people are hungry. They're weary and they're thirsty in the wilderness. Well, just who is this man? Well, we see from verses 28 through 29 what is stated in the New King James in verse 19 when it says he's a very wealthy man. But pay especially attention when he says he brought beds and basins. Why would that stand out so much? Because David has been running. David's had no bed to sleep in. And now Barzillai is going to provide a bed for David to sleep upon. He's going to provide the provisions for all of those who are with David to eat. Here, Barzillai obviously is very wealthy. You come also back to 2 Samuel chapter 19 and verse 31 and 32. And Barzillai the Gileadite came down from Regulam and went across the river Jordan with the king to escort him across the Jordan. And Barzillai was a very aged man, 80 years old. And he provided the king with supplies while he stayed at Menahem, for he was a very rich or very great man. What you see now is that he was very kind. He was a very kind and generous man. In fact, when you look at these 5 characters we've notified, obviously Barzillai is the one that stands out to be kind and generous. He's the one that stands out as my favorite of all these 5. He was a chieftain. He would have been the head of a tribe, if you will. And he went to great lengths to help David. It would have been about 20 to 25 miles approximately traveling one way for him to have traveled the distance from his home to be where David was at. That would have been a 50-mile round trip that Barzillai would have encountered to care for David. He would have gone from Menahem back to the Jordan where David would have crossed, and then back to Jerusalem, and it would have been 20 to 25 miles. Here he accommodates David to the Jordan, and beyond that to Gilgal, close enough to Jericho. Another interesting thing about Barzillai is the king says in verse 33, and the king said to Barzillai, come across with me, and I'll provide for you while you are with me in Jerusalem. You see that he also is a very old man, verse 32, but you also see he's a man that is not interested in his personal benefits. He's not out for himself here. He's not out to try to, as it were, kiss up, to nuzzle up to the king. This is King David. And David's going to be reinstated. The Barzillai doesn't play the nuzzle up card to David. He doesn't want something from David. He's doing all this out of interest to simply help David. And so when the king returns, he finds the same spirit active in the life of this man that is faithful. And Barzillai, while old, kept working for his king. He sided with David and never left David's side, even though Absalom had prevailed. He was willing to risk all. He was willing to risk all that he had. All that he had, he believed to be right with God because of David and who he was. His Godward orientation led him to believe that David was God's anointed. You know, David said of Saul, I will not lay my hand on God's anointed. And here Barzillai recognizes who David is as God's anointed. In fact, he says again, you cross over with me. But out of appreciation for what David, for what had been done for him, David offered Barzillai Jerusalem to come with him, and he refused it. A reminder that David was capable of great generosity to those who had been his friends in times of trouble. He might have spared Shimei or believed Mephibosheth for political reasons, but he would neglect this old man who shared his worldly goods with him. Then you come to verses 34 through 36, and you see again the grand offer that David gives Barzillai. Some, as I read preparing for this, viewed verses 34 through 36 as Barzillai making excuses. So he's excusing himself. This is why I can't come. I don't think that's the way the narrative flows. I think the narrative flows as it does because Barzillai is a very gracious man. He's done nothing at this time to indicate that he would do anything to give any reflection on David at all that was negative. And so what I think is, here's Barzillai as this older man. And what he's simply saying is, I'm an older man, please let me stay. And so read what we have in verse 34 through 36. He said to the king, how long have I to live, that I should go up with the king to Jerusalem? I'm today 80 years old. Can I discern between good and bad? Can your servant taste what to eat or what to drink? Can I hear any longer the voice of singing men and singing women? Why then should your servant be a further burden to my Lord? Your servant will go a little ways across the Jordan with the king, and why should the king repay me with such a reward? Please let your servant return back again, that I may die near my home city. Barzillai wasn't interested in gaining anything from David. He wasn't interested in gaining anything from David, as he had given David what David needed in his great hour of need, in his darkest moments. He had no interest in gaining from the advantage that he had over David. And he says, I'm just too old. And he admits it. In fact, what he says is, listen, I'm so old, I've lost my sense of taste. I can't tell the difference between a filet mignon and mush. I've just totally lost my sense of taste. Please let me go back to my homeland. He prefers to stay with his homeland. And then you see, finally, you see that Barzillai is also loyal and faithful. Barzillai's rationale for accepting David's offer for wisdom is significant. New experiences can be exciting to everybody. But as we get a little bit older, we like home. We like it stayed. We don't want a lot of changes. Josiah was interesting to me. I love because it spoke to a young man and can speak to young people. I love that because, as you know, I have 8 grandkids, from 18 down to 4. And I like to identify with them. And Josiah is a great lesson. And you know, young people like to explore. They're fearless in what they do. They don't know what they don't know. They don't know the danger that's there. The psalmist said, I've been old and I've been young. But the problem with the young is they've only been young. They've never been old. The young, their filter's wide open. I mean, the horizon is their field. But then Barzillai appeals to me because he's 80 years old. And as you know, I have a mom and dad, age 92 and age 89. And I'm concerned about them. And I'm concerned about what happens to older people and how we treat older people. And I'm concerned that younger people recognize older people. But one thing have observed, and it's not a criticism, is that the older you get, the less you get out and the more around home you stay. Unless there's something exceptional that takes place. Brian is about 8 to 10 miles from Mom and Dad live, and Friday is their day to go to town. Other than that, they don't get out of Benchley much, which is just a little way station in the road, except to go to the church building and back. They like home. They like being home. So this last week when my uncle's funeral took place at Prairie Point Cemetery in the big metropolis of Barzillai, just a little bit northwest of Kearns. Dad said, let's go on ahead of the procession. I want to see Mom and Dad's grave. And so we went ahead of the procession. Totally different side because sadly the cemetery population has grown. Totally different side, pulled up there, and for about 2 minutes, got out of the car and looked at Nanny and Granddad's headstone. Then went back over where my uncle was going to be buried, and there's a whole other line of Jenkins on that side. And there's a headstone that gives the birth date for Jessa Marie Jenkins. Dad left that area a long time ago. But that's where he plans to go back. Why? Because it's home. He said, son, why don't y'all be buried out here? I said, Dad, I lost nothing out there. Prairie Point doesn't mean anything to me. It'll mean something to me because you're there, but I got no skin in this game. This is the closest thing I've ever had to home, folks. Every 3 to 4 years until Dad moved to Denton, that was it. 11 and a half years he was in Denton. And I'm in my 28th year here. This is closest home I get. And I don't know where life will take me in the future. But here he says, I want to stay close to home. David, I understand what you're offering me. But he did not want to end life in Jerusalem. He wanted to end life home. But he asked this, will you take the young man, Kittim, and will you take him with you? And according to 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 7, David does that. And the last words were in verse 39. King Barzillai blessed him, and he returned to his own place. One of the best expressions of gratitude to those who have befriended us is to look for opportunities to be of assistance not only to them, but to their children. And I think Kittim probably was the son of Barzillai. And what he's saying is, I'm not going to go, but please take my son and care for him. You can care for the person, or you can help care for the children. And that does just as much for them as caring for them. Well, what are some takeaways from this? What are some takeaways from this story? First of all, we need to see that old age is nothing to be ashamed of, and that frailties of old age should be freely embraced. Look again at verse 35. I am today 80 years old. Can I discern between good and bad? Can your servant taste what I eat or what I drink? Can I hear any longer the voice of singing men and singing women? Why then should your servant be a further burden to the Lord my King? Does that remind you of the words of Solomon in Ecclesiastes chapter 12? It talks about you lose your teeth, you lose your eyesight, the hair grows gray, and your hearing goes, and your taste buds go. That's where Barzillai says I'm at. He said, look, I'm too old to do this. But notice, old age is not a curse. It's not something to be ashamed of. And he embraced his old age. The second thing that I see in this is that he faced old age gracefully. Look at verse 34. But Barzillai said to the king, how long have I to live that I should go up to the king to Jerusalem? Verse 37, please let your servant turn back again, that I may die in my city, near the grave of my father, my mother. But here is your servant, Kimham. Let him cross over with my lord the king to do for him what seems good to you. He knew he could not turn back the hands of time. But he had a few more steps in life's journey. and the loss of those things that were once so dear to him led him to the longing of the land which God shall wipe away tears from their eyes, and where there shall be no more death. And then you see verse 35, the latter part. Why then should my servant be a further burden to my Lord, your king? When David considerately and rightfully offered to care for this aged benefactor David, there was no N-O, there was no you owe it to me. Look at all I have done for you attitude on the part of this venerable aged man. He had considerate concern for others, realizing he could do little to help and perhaps much more to hinder. And then he spent his old age helping others. You look back at chapter 17, as we read in verses 27 through 29. Here Barzillai and the men come and they bring grain, they bring a bed, they bring all the things that David needs. We saw in verses 31 through 32, again, of chapter 19, how he was a very rich man, and he demonstrates that. What impresses me is the word retirement. Serving the king was not in the vocabulary of Barzillai. And how sad it is that retirement is taken all too literally by saints of age today, and to see those with so much to offer either get on the road again or sit down and turn the Lord's work over to the younger and less mature. That's not supposed to be on there. So here you have a careful consideration of Barzillai, who was an example to the younger people. He gave himself to others so that he could save his own. No doubt, Barzillai could have rationalized, instead of making a generous provision for David, I need to save my wealth for my children. But Barzillai evidently understood that joy came from giving. And he gave. He gave to David. Barzillai was faithful to David. And he kept living, giving until the king returned. And the question is this: when the king returns, will he find that same spirit active in the lives of faithful people today? Yes, Barzillai was old, but he kept working. He kept working for the king. Will we be found working when King Jesus returns? I beg, please don't spend your older years AWOL. We have so many of age that continue to serve the Lord faithfully. And yes, while you may not walk as fast as you once did, please still go the extra mile to serve God and help others in need. And thank God, we have many in this congregation that are still working, that are laboring in the vineyard for the Master. I'm going to borrow something from Jordan last week. Jordan last week, at this point in his sermon, spoke to the older people. And in speaking to the older people, he said, you need to recognize that these young people are not the church of tomorrow, they're the church of today. Well, I want to say something to the older people. You're not the Christians of yesterday. You're not the church of yesterday. God has no grandchildren and no grandparents. Only children. And the question is, how will we meet the King when he returns? In verse 39, all the people crossed over Jordan, and the king crossed too. The king then kissed Barzillai and blessed him, and he returned to his place. Despite his strange name, Barzillai was a man with a great reputation of loyalty to God and to his king. He was kind to others under his care. And despite being a man of wealth, he used his influence for the benefit of others and lived a simple life. His powerful example of legacy is that of a conqueror. One person can have through loving God and serving others during difficult times. And now I want to say something to the young people. Jordan preached to the old people last week, and I want to preach to the young people just a minute. Jordan said yet last week, and rightfully so, you're the church of today. And he had all the older people stand up and vow to you that these older people would walk with you. Now, what I want to challenge you with, younger people, is will you hold the hand of those who are older? They're not two sets of rules. You have the same responsibility for hospitality that older people have. What if, young people, you found someone of age and you went up and spoke to them and asked them to tell you something about their life story? What if, young people, you and your mother and dad found an older person in this congregation and said, will you go out to lunch with us? What if, young people, you stood in the foyer, you stood at the doors? Have you ever noticed always the older guys standing at the doors? What if, young people, you stood out in the foyer, you stood at the doors, and as these older people walk in, you greet them and tell them hi and say, I sure am glad to see you today. I was looking forward to seeing you today. Young people, why is it you get a pass? Jordan told the old people, get over it. The young people are the church of today. Young people, you have a responsibility just like the older people. And so my challenge to you is this. Don't, when you come here, just come in and sit down. You find someone older, not because they're owed it, but because they're older and you respect them. Let me ask you something, young people. If that is impossible for you to do, please stand up. Nobody stood. You know what that means? You just said you would do it. My dad told me this story a few years ago. There was a horse that worked in a sawmill pulling logs from the river to the mill. When old, he was retired and put out to pasture. But every morning at starting time, the horse was at the mill and all day long walked beside the younger horses to and from the river that now pulled the logs. And the point is, older people, is when you're old and cannot do the things you used to do, you can still walk beside the younger people. Don't quit. Do what you can. Now the question comes, who are the older people? Well, Barzillai was 80 years old, and that's where we'll start. You find someone 80 years old, and you go speak to them. And if Mike Fleming looks 80 years old, though he's not, you can still go speak to him. A few years ago, I forget how long ago it's been now, we had a class called Wisdom from the Sages. And in that class, and this will tell you how many men we've lost, Hobie Everson said this. Well, I thought he did. Can you advance it for me back there, Brad? Put the quote up, please. Just because we're old does not mean we don't know what we're talking about. And how many times do we as younger people look at these older people and say, "You doddering old person, don't you know life has passed you by? Don't you know you really don't know what you're talking about?" Young people, you know what they want? They want the same thing you want. They want to be noticed. They want to be loved. And they want to be respected.